So this week on the traditional church calendar is what's often called Transfiguration Sunday. This is kind of the last Sunday before we go into the long season of Lent, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. But I really think whoever came up with this idea of studying the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus going up on the mountain and kind of having his glory revealed was a brilliant touch. I think maybe they noticed the way that this episode is structured within the book of Mark and notice that it's an excellent connection to Lent overall. So, in the Gospel of Mark, which is the version we're going to read today, there is no resurrection appearance. It's still a little unclear if there was another ending of Mark that is lost, or if it was meant to end on this kind of cliffhanger where we get the news of Jesus' resurrection, but they don't actually meet him. And so, either way, I think the story works with this kind of cool cliffhanger ending. But this is the moment after the cross, after all the destruction, that we actually see Jesus glorified. We see the confirmation that he is, in fact, God. And it functions in the story as kind of, if you're going on a long journey and you're on this kind of mountaintop, and you can kind of see where things are having. You have the perspective before you kind of dive back down into the valley. Maybe you're even walking into, you're up above the clouds and you have to walk back down into below the clouds in the darkness. And I think this story functions this way for the Gospel of Mark, but also for Lent itself. We get to see this kind of this high point, the big picture, the perspective, before we kind of get back down into the valley, back down into the weeds of life and of Lent itself, and focusing on some of those harder aspects of life, our own humility, etc., which, again, we'll talk more about next week. So that's kind of the overall picture as we're looking at this Transfiguration Sunday. So first, let me just read Mark's account of this remarkable story. So 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and he brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone. He was transformed in front of them. His clothes were amazingly brighter than if they had been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't know how to respond, for the 3 of them were terrified. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, "This is my son whom I dearly love. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So, there is so much going on. Obviously, the power of this experience was one which they're kind of overwhelmed. We even hear kind of Peter stumbling around, which I love Peter because he, of course, feels the need to react and do something. He's a man of action, even though he's clearly terrified and confused by the experience overall. And people have looked back on this experience and realized there's a lot going on here. The language and the way in which Mark tells it, the just kind of Old Testament references that are woven into this moment, the connections to other parts of the gospel. The gospel writer Mark himself recognized just how important and pivotal this moment was, and he weaves a lot of that in using most likely Peter's reflection of the event to kind of think it through. So the moment we can get the story, right? We can get what happened, just like the disciples did, just the raw power of the moment. But then on further reflection of it, we can kind of recognize some of this just kind of intense tapestry, this culmination of other themes and things that have been going on, which I think Mark invites us into as a writer, and we as readers later on and as modern day disciples can continue thinking about. So let me just start with some of these just kind of random notes that talk about the significance of this event. So one is the setting, right? Yet again, they find themselves in the wilderness. In Mark, there's this very strong contrast between kind of Jesus' ministry in the city and with the crowds in the center near the temple, places where one would expect to be hearing about God and knowing about God, and where God is tending to work, which is on the fringes with outcasts and losers and sinners. And then we see this represented physically as well. The wilderness, was not, beauty and pristine as we kind of in this post-romantic world think of it. That was an unsafe place. It was the place of wild animals. It was the place where you needed to be protected. It was the place where demons lived. And so, surprisingly, again and again, Mark likes to point out that God is working on the fringes, not just of people, but of the cosmic world, that God is doing things in unexpected places. And so we get this recognition of God's presence in the wilderness. Moments like these mountaintop experiences in Celtic spirituality are sometimes called thin places, the places where kind of the true nature of things, of the cosmos, of the spiritual realities, get a little thin compared to the barrier, all these things we erect with our own minds to say that the world is in fact just ordinary or material. And so I've always found that a very kind of helpful, just kind of metaphor of the thin places, the places where God is close and obvious, and it's so easy to see that there is more going on. So this is very much an important transcendental experience for them, just both understanding Jesus and just with its sheer power. I think it's going to affect all three of these men that get to be a part of it. So there's been a lot of scholarly research on and thinking through what does this meeting with Elijah and with Moses maybe mean? And so, you can look at it symbolically. Obviously, Moses represents kind of the law and the Torah, this important foundation of identity for Jewish people. And then we've kind of got, whereas Moses kind of helps create the establishment of religion, then we also have the kind of prophetic voice, right? Speaking directly for God, again, often as outsiders that are critiquing. And these are kind of the two sections of the Old Testament, and these are two men who are also associated with their encounters with God, specifically on mountains. There are also men who, kind of according to legend, according to the Old Testament as well, have kind of iffy deaths on mountains. We're not totally sure how they died, or if it was kind of the normal way of dying, or if God Elijah, we know God snatched up in some way, and there were a lot of legends that something similar happened to Moses. And I really like the irony of this story as well, because both of these men went up on mountaintops and met with God face to face during their ministry, right? This is one of the defining moments of why they are both such important representatives of kind of what it is they do. And the irony here, of course, is they are finding themselves yet again on a mountaintop, meeting face to face with God. But whereas last time, these experiences, God is huge and glorified and shiny, this time they are coming and meeting with God, who is humble and who is human and who is easily missed. And so I think Mark really recognizes how cool this is, that at one point they were traveling up a mountain to meet with God, and now they're coming from heaven to meet with God, because God is coming up to meet them from this place of humility. I just think it's a really, just a neat language. So again, the story itself is just drenched in like theophany language. So some of the language comes from kind of current Greek mythological thinking, that you would get these just kind of certain ways of describing when people met with the gods, when the gods broke through and did something big and special. We also get a lot of the imagery and language that we get from Old Testament meetings with God. We've got the glory of God, we've got the voices from heaven, we've got the light, and the just people being wowed by how bright and shiny Jesus' own clothing are. But again, the irony is, of course, this is very much a theophany, and yet Jesus is not going up to meet with God on the mountain. People are coming down to meet with him, because God is now among us and God is small. And so, there's a lot of different directions we can go there. There's a lot kind of packed into that. But as always, I think, Mark was a very practical writer, and we've set up the rhythms of Lent and all these things to help modern day disciples say, okay, what are we meant to learn from this story of the Transfiguration, of Jesus being shown in his glory before he goes down and begins his journey toward the cross, which of course would have been the absolute last thing in his disciples' mind, especially after seeing a moment of glory like this one. So there's one hint in the story that the first mention of the resurrection was right before this. And in the piece I read, it's a little hard to catch that, but Mark sets this up very intentionally in his gospel, and the other gospels kind of echo it, in that this key moment of Peter recognizing who Jesus is. He says, "You're the Messiah, you're the Son of God," right? Although his expectations of what that meant were not there yet, Jesus affirms that and says, "Yes, I am the Son of God, I am the Messiah, I am the waited one." And then he immediately tells them about the cross, the crucifixion. I'm going to be misunderstood, I'm going to be killed, and then I will be resurrected, right? And so this story is meant to be heard in light of that revelation. The fact, yes, I am God, and they're going to kill me for it, right? My glory is not revealed in this big, shiny God, but my glory is in fact revealed in what I'm willing to do for humanity. And so I think we can make the mistake of wanting to skip to the happy ending, right? And that's what we do a lot of the time in Easter. That's why I think Lent is so important for us to actually slow down and recognize that, does human history have a happy ending? Yes. Is God's work in on earth culminated in the resurrection, the power of life and light and goodness overcoming darkness? Yes. And yet, the cross is so important for understanding God. God did not choose to simply snap his fingers and make all things better. God chose to come, be among us, and to suffer and take all the pain and poison of sin and death and the darkness in the world into himself, right? That it could die and that he could resurrect and heal. And the same thing is true for disciples. He does not ask us to have easy lives in which everything goes our way, despite the fact that many churches try to give us that version. Resurrection only makes sense if you have died first. And that continues to be the invitation that Jesus makes to his disciple. And so I think one of the major reasons this story is so important is because it teaches us what God is actually like. We want to have the big, shiny, powerful God and say, hey, and we can kind of bask in his glory, right? That's what the disciples were hoping for too. And yet, again and again, the New Testament tells us, yes, God is powerful and glorious and all those things, but if you really want to know what God is like, the lens always has to be Jesus. He was poor, he was humble, he was misunderstood, except by those who needed him, right? And that piece of who God is, God's willingness to take on pain, death, so that he could be resurrected, I think shows us what true glory and true strength actually are. We want to skip to the end. We want to think of being able to do whatever we want. We want to have this abstract God, when in reality, we have a God who is very humble and who took on us and all the mess that we have made of our own hearts and our world around us. He took that on, became that it could be healed. And so those two pieces can't really be separated. God's glory is also shown in his crucifixion. And if we take either of those pieces away, we don't really get who God is, just like we don't get who God is if we don't look first and foremost at Jesus. And so the transfiguration and the cross of Lent have to be together, and they have to be together for his disciples as well, because I think one really important thing was, after they've had this glorious moment, right, it could be very easy to make the mistake, as the disciples did, of when everything just went to hell, when Jesus was killed, to think that, well, Jesus was clearly crazy. Jesus was wrong. God is not like that. And we can feel that same way when we are in the midst of pain and suffering, right? And yet God, I think, to encourage them beforehand, warned them, says, no, this is who I am. I am glorified. I am the culmination that Moses was looking forward to, that Elijah was looking forward to. All of this stuff I've been doing is coming together towards this moment. I do know what I'm doing. And yet we're going to walk back down the mountain together. We will go through the darkness, even the darkness of the torture and the horrors of the cross and hell itself, because on the other side, I will be restored, still scarred. I will be restored to my glory and show you what goodness and life actually can look like. And so I think The encouragement for this is sometimes our experiences of God are going to be a lot like um, that of the disciples here. They are just overwhelmed by the sheer power and glory and beauty of God, which is, I think, why God the Father reminds them, hey, listen to him. I'm affirming who this is. Listen to him. He's saying things you don't necessarily want to hear. He's saying things that are going to be hard for you to comprehend until you've seen and trusted. He tells them bluntly many times, I am going to die. I am going to be resurrected, right? And they don't hear it because they don't want to. They don't have a concept of this. And yet, at the same time, when our experiences of God are so overwhelming, we continue to think about them. We continue to notice details of why they might be important, just like the disciples did. And when we go back down into the valley, whether it's metaphorically in a time of Lent where we force ourselves to slow down and think about those things, whether it's the intense suffering that comes from living in a broken world around broken people like ourselves, or whether it's bearing a cross that is other people, entering intentionally into places of pain that need healing, knowing that we are overwhelmed, that we can't do enough, we need God to do those things. It can be easy in those moments when you have experienced the fullness and the greatness of God to want to stay there, like they did, to not have the courage to walk back down off the mountaintop, back into the darkness, knowing that what's waiting for us is a cross, but also taking seriously the cross is not the end of the story. So yeah, we're looking forward to Easter, and that's why we bookend this kind of more somber time of Lent with first the Transfiguration, saying this is a foretaste of where we're heading. And then, of course, with the ultimate celebration of God's life and light and win over sin, death, darkness, everything else, that is Easter morning. So we'll go into Lent celebrating both the Transfiguration this week and the resurrection at the end of this whole thing. So that's, yeah, the Transfiguration Sunday.